without further ado, I welcome the first speaker of the examining team to open the team's case.
When there is only one seemingly correct way to perceive a text, the people who engage in literature is limited, and the capacity to how you engage with this is completely ruined. Okay, firstly some framing, then on absolutism and elitism, and then on finding yourself through subtext within books. Okay. Firstly, on framing, right? So, generally, the purpose of literature, right? We think that literature provides enrichment, understanding, and education. It's the only way to, see someone's, inner thoughts from, 100 years ago, right? It is culturally relevant. It, defines references in pop culture. But also, quite importantly, literature is often seen as, a hallmark to, higher society, right? I think that, often literature is, a barrier to entry for marginalized people, to be seen as, educated and important and know what they're talking about, right? I think, at the lowest end, literature just brings, entertainment and joy to people, right? I also think another piece of important framing here is the literary canon is restricted and elitist. I think the literary canon is mainly a collection of books chosen by old white men, often classics by people like Shakespeare, right? They typically don't entail stories of women, queer people, or marginalized communities in particularly good ways, right? Also note here the author's purpose is often defined by the people who define the literary canon, right? The people who are deciding what the correct way to perceive this text are the people who are old white English professors who have spent their entire life just reading Shakespeare, right? This is very important for how the debate sits. What this means is that in a world where depth of the author is not widespread, there is only one interpretation commonly and widely accepted and regarded to as correct. This doesn't involve positive representation of marginalized people in most cases. Okay, on absolutism and elitism. So some context here, right? When there is only one way to view the text, people are systemically locked out of literature, feel bad about themselves, feel stupid, and generally don't engage. A couple of mechanisms here. Firstly, feeling stupid and dejected, right? When you don't understand the correct interpretation, right? Your criticisms are not seen as valid interpretations. They are seen as wrong answers. You can be incorrect in English in their world, right? Because as per the info slide, the meaning of a text is entirely determined by the author's intention. What does this look like? This looks like a young Jewish student being told their interpretation of Shylock is wrong because you don't think that he was the villain and wasn't evil, but you're telling that it's incorrect because Shakespeare was racist, right? I think that they get that C-, they get told the essay is terrible, right? They're incorrect on something that's really, really interpersonal and awful to them. How do these racist stereotypes, when validated by the literary canon, actually stand to these people? I think it makes them feel absolutely awful, right? Second mech here, intimidation, right? You must now understand the background context. Why engage with a text if you just might not be able to get the correct answer all the time, right? This idea of correctness creates a massive barrier to entry, and people are intimidated and don't want to even try. Okay, third here, right? The idea just doesn't occur to you in their world that you can question these things, that you could find a new interpretation, right? I think here literature just is more nuanced and interesting on our side of the house because you aren't just regurgitating the same information over and over. You're going to engage with literature because you can be interesting, you can be original, you can find a new interpretation, you can put your own spin on it. This is what draws young people into these areas. This is what makes literature feel personally and emotionally valuable to people. I think this is really important, right? Fourth mech then, on absolutism, right? The idea of a correct text can lead to the weaponization of famous texts. I think this exists on a scale, right? On like the highest end, this looks at things like the Bible. Like if there's only one way it can be read, it just gets used against queer people and women because, the Bible says this exactly, this is the only way to perceive it, this is like how you should be treated as per that in accordance to that, right? I think on the lower end, this just looks like things like Harry Potter, right? Like there's like racist stereotypes without the nuance, without the J.K. Rowling's intention wasn't to be good to gay people, right? You really just don't interpret it very well. Okay, what are the outcomes of this point, right? So there's a comparative here, right? There's a world in which you engage in changing how a text is relevant, right? You can have positive iterations of Christianity where you believe that the Bible can be adapted to a modern context, right? Where women have a place at work. You take the general principles. In comparison, there's a world where you don't view literature in this way, right? There's an absolutely one view. Maybe you just get shunned as a gay Christian. If you don't believe the Bible material, I think that still, this just looks like a young girl reading Harry Potter in one world when there's a really racist caricature of Indian people. She just feels really terrible because that's exactly how the author intended it, therefore it's what the book means. In the other world, I think this is very different because instead now, there's a whole community of people who have a different interpretation, who don't care what J.K. Rowling thinks. I think this is very important. Okay. I think another outcome here is more people engage in literature because they can change how they perceive it, right? For example, in their world, women just probably are way less incentivized to read Shakespeare because it just feels bad to be so diminished, right? I wouldn't read any literature from 200 years ago if I can put a feminist view on it because it just makes me feel terrible if they're just talking about women as objects and decoration, right? I also think people just feel more confident. They feel more confident in their critical thinking, right? There's more interest in higher education, more access to these elitist conversations, more college degrees, diverse academic outcomes, right? I will take a POI now.
The misinterpretations of the Bible come with people looking at a text that was made and applying their own views, such as this passage means that queer people are wrong. Why has that not led to all the harms that you've just described?
Okay, look, I think you're telling me here about how the misinterpretation of the Bible is from modern things. Look, I think in 3,000 years ago, people also thought women were objects and that gay people were wrong, right? I think that a lot of these things actually do originate from outdated views that pervades through the text. Okay, so on subtext and finding yourself within these texts. So some context here, right? Representation isn't common in a lot of literature. I told you this earlier, right? When you can have your own way that is credible and accepted and supported of partaking in books, you can feel seen, you can engage in this literature, right? So firstly, subtext, right? While books don't overtly discuss, you can find subtext not included on purpose, right? This looks like Frankenstein and Victor Frankenstein's slightly homoerotic subtext, right? I think that's just switch in the Matrix, right? I think that secondly, rewrites, right? Things like feminist interpretations that Huckleberry Finn rewrite from the perspective of the slave was very recent, gave lots of positive press, right? I think this is really good. Thirdly, more diverse theories are written about and discussed frequently. They become more mainstream. Fourthly, you just read books, even though the author sucks, right? You reinterpret them. You this. I gave you the example of J.K. Rowling, right? She obviously didn't write Harry Potter for the purpose of representing gay people, but gay Harry Potter fan fiction is absolutely thriving, right? I think your local 13-year-old queer kid just has a text to apply these features to. They feel less alone. They feel a lot better about themselves if you make it represent you. Their outcomes at this point in their world, these people are told they're wrong. But here, it allows you to be yourself in day-to-day life. You can see yourself in things. Maybe you're even comfortable enough to, come out to your parents, say you have a boyfriend, something like that, right? Online communities, right? There's a level of discussion that cannot exist without this widespread adoption of the belief that you have the ability to reinterpret, to critique, to discuss this text. Queer people of color, feminists, these themes are found in books, in media. You can always find catharsis. You don't just rely on queer media. You can engage in all media as if it were queer. This means there's not that isolation and that feeling of awful for having to seek out something that specifically represents you. You can be included in all things. I am proud to stand.
We thank the speaker for this speech and welcome up the first speaker of the debating team to open their team's case.
Books give you knowledge. Knowledge is power. Books are powerful. F stands for lessening the knowledge that books give you and the unique power that authors do have. This is extremely bad. Firstly, in this speech, I'm going to go over the unique effect of the authors, and then I'm going to go over how having an author's intention and focusing on this is extremely important for the readers. So first, and the rebuttal will be integrated throughout my speech because a lot of our material directly combats what they are trying to tell you. So firstly, on the author. A bit of context here. We agree with F's characterization around the author's right to either inform, entertain, or to share their perspective and experiences to get readers to think about what they, as the author, is saying. With the death of the author theory, this intention is taken completely out of the way of writing, and this is so vital. So why is this true? It takes the author completely out of the equation and silencing their stories. We don't see this affecting any of the books that are made to inform, because these are laying out the facts. But we see, nor do we see them affecting the books around entertainment, because these are the ones with the focus are symmetric on both sides, because authors' intention is to entertain, and the reader's interpretation is paralleled. Therefore, the only remaining category we see this motion affecting is the experiences and the perspectives the authors are sharing, because either they will be doing it because they think you relate to it, or B, because they don't think you've heard it before and they think it is important for you to hear. And that you should hear it, both of which are extremely important. Secondly, when it becomes about the reader's interpretations, misconceptions such as perceived discrimination or co-opting of the story and experiences begins to occur. This is very damaging to the author, as you are watching someone completely ignore your voice, and you are watching society completely apply the majority lens when they are depicting your words. This is really, really harmful, because imagine writing when you're most vulnerable, you're sharing your experiences when you are most vulnerable, and then completely being ignored. How does this author feel? Will they want to get it right again? No, probably not. Why would you want to when you're just getting polarized by society? And this is really, really damaging to this author. Note here that this directly combats what they are trying to tell you about literacy canon and only focusing on what old white guys care about, because actually it provides a voice to these experiences, and this is really important to be able to share them and be able to go on along with this. So what are the outcomes of this? This means that the author can't get their point across. If they are trying to tell a world and they're trying to share their unique experiences, they are not able to do this. If they're in a world where the majority have now adopted the death of author theory, their style of writing will become shallow and superficial to ensure that the literary analysis caters to everybody's interpretation, which means that the really important messages and meaningful messages that we need to hear in society, sometimes the hard truths we need to hear in society, actually aren't being said and aren't being shared, and this is really harmful not only to the reader but also to the writer, because now the author is not doing this form of writing of their experiences, which obviously they care about. If they've chosen this specific profession, they've chosen this specific aspect of writing, they're going to care about it. They're doing it to share these things, and now they're getting completely ignored by society. That's so damaging for this author. We see this prompt a change in authors and how they write. Those who previously wanted to share these vulnerable experiences cannot, because of fear that their story, for example, an Asian American woman now being co-opted by white feminists, and now it's just not being actually acknowledged for what it is and what it's actually about. This is really damaging for those people not being able to share, but also now we don't have these important voices in society. These are the voices that build the understanding and the inclusivity in the world that is so very needed, and they enable society to progress. Without them, where would we be? So why is this so important? Even if you don't buy that these perspectives will be twisted into a misconception or co-opted, which is very harmful, as I have told you, you have to buy that through this theory, the authors will change how they write to adapt to this, and importantly, the types of books that this debate is actually about simply will not exist. So, now on to my second point around the reader. So, why is the death of the author theory so bad for the readers? Firstly, they get a less diverse range of literature, because obviously when you're applying your interpretation to everything and every text, you are disregarding the author's intention, and you're getting a polarized perspective of what you're reading, especially in the context of literary analysis that we see in this debate. For example, if you're in a class and you're studying The Handmaid's Tale, we see it as super beneficial to be able to depict why the author actually wrote it, And as it was a very vital prediction for the future that Margaret Atwood was warning us of, this is actually very important because we are thinking about what was she thinking? Why was she writing it? In this point in time, where she was standing at that point in history, why did she think it was so beneficial for us to hear this message? What was her intention behind this? If we get behind this thinking, we see that it was a warning for the future that we are now seeing to repeat into today's society, and we're seeing this as super duper harmful if we are ignoring this. You cannot learn from others in time or from different people's perspectives if you are constantly looking and applying your own lens. How do you learn from thoughts and feelings and how through history of these authors if we do not focus on their intention? Intention comes from the context of the time period they're in because there was a need for that message to be told at the point in time where they wrote that book. So what are the outcomes of this? You have a less diverse range of books, which is super harmful to the reader as well. This theory leaves them with an incapability to understand the important messages and that they have been written through history, and therefore we are not able to learn from these things through history that are so important. Particularly because a lot of these threats do not seem as proximate because they happened a long time ago. It actually reminds people of what can go wrong and lets people understand the intention. You can comprehend how challenging these situations must have been in a way you wouldn't actually be able to comprehend otherwise. So why is this so important? These perspectives enable you to consider the issues outside of yourself. So importantly, without them, you would have this very narrow perspective. Considering the global reach and the global scale that books have, we see this as super harmful as it extends to all of society, conforming into that majority perspective and that majority lens. This completely disregards the minorities that AF is trying to claim they care about so much because it's putting them all into this majority perspective and this lens, disregarding everybody who does not fall into these groups. I will take a POI quickly if you have one.
Yeah, if you're in an English class, are you more likely to be forced to read Margaret Atwood's books or Shakespeare's books?
I'm reading Margaret Atwood at the moment, so I don't know what that says about that. We're currently learning about The Handmaid's Tale, and we are learning about why she wrote that book and why it is so vital in the time where we are seeing Trump do similar things restricting women's rights around reproduction, and we're seeing it as so vital in that time. So by the end of the speech, what have I told you? We've proven to you about the importance of the author's perspective and how insanely damaging it is to have your voice silenced as an author when that's your purpose to get into writing. When you choose to get into writing, you're getting your voice completely silenced. Think of the harm to that individual. Think of how they must feel when they are being ignored. They finally take the courage to step out of this box. They finally stand up and say their story, and it is being silenced. How would that feel when people try and co-opt your experiences into their own? So by the end of the speech, I've told you why it's both damaging to both parties involved. This theory is authors tell the readers what to do, but readers are the ones who actually enact the real change. So when authors are harmed, readers are harmed, and the world cannot change for the better, which is what it needs to do. Which is why we believe that the death of authors theory should be the thing to die. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the second speaker of the affirming team.
To quote Oscar Wilde, "Women are just interior decoration. If I only listened to the author's purpose, I would never read a single classic again." Okay, what am I going to do in my speech? On the author, on the reader, counterfactual, and framing. Starting with framing. Okay, look, we tell you about the literary canon, considering the high works of literature being, the old white men, like the pale male stale, like all those really, really old, but yet valued so highly books, right? We tell you also that these are the books is necessary to engage with to get higher education, to move in those circles in society where you you have to be elite, right? Like university studies these like really old classics texts, right? What does it mean when you only have the author's perspective? It means you get quotes like women are just interior decoration. It means half the population or more like does not see themselves in it. We give the example of the Merchant of Venice, right? When a Jewish student says, hey, maybe Shylock isn't a villain, that is just wrong. That is not the right interpretation. That is not how the author meant it to be. You are wrong. You are never going to like university as an English student. This is really, really harmful, right? I think they need to do a lot of work on framing, like just like if they don't contest our literacy canon material, we just like win the debate because for every one like diverse author they get on their side, we just get like their 100 classic pale male style books. Okay then, firstly on the author. They tell you that the author creates with purpose and that the only books in this debate are the ones that affect their specific experiences and perspectives. I think this is just not true. I think a major part of this debate is the books written to entertain. Why? Because that is the books most people read, right? I think the reader is a massive part of it. Obviously, I'll go into that later, but I think when you are also books to entertain still have underlying messages. They still have morals. They still have characters that could be portrayed in really racist ways, right? They still have themes. I think what this means is that the author's purpose very clearly matters in entertainment books too. Okay, what do they tell you? They tell you that every diverse author that puts out a message is it's going to be distorted and vulnerable. I think firstly there's a missing link here. I think more work needs to be done. I don't think every book that gets put out instantly is distorted. The author's purpose is completely ignored whatsoever, and everyone just puts their own super white supremacist thing on it. But sure, we'll pretend that this MEC is in fact filled in. Why is this still not likely to be the case? Look, I think if the author really, really cares, so much like they're telling about, if they really want to share their message, they are going to be more clear about it. Instead of hiding it in layers and layers of subtext, right? I think they just share. They share their experiences. They're honest. They share it very clearly, right? I think then we flip this material about them becoming their style of writing becomes shallow and diluted, because then I think anyone can apply it whatever perspective at all they want to that, right? I think in order for their message to not be wiped out, they become more clear. They very clearly show their message in the book, right? I think this just means this book is now more accessible, more people can read it and understand the message. That is always a good thing for the author, right? And also here that I think a lot of their benefits now don't stand. I think diverse authors still very much have a market share. But firstly, even if you believe all their case, I just don't think this matters very much in the debate at all. Why? Firstly, for every one author, there's 1 million people reading their books. This means you should always prioritize the reader more. And also think a majority of the time, I think interpretations are good for the author because it just means more people are interested in the books. This means more people buying it. This means more royalties for the author. This means they can write more books. I think that is always going to be a good thing for them. Okay then, on the more important, the reader, right? These are the people who the literature really matters in the debate. These are the people who read it for fun. These are the people who read it and it enguts his critical thinking. These are the people who it literally matters their lives. Okay, what do we hear from the negating side? We hear about how their material on this diversity and polarization just means that all the books are boring. I think I already dealt with this, and also just note there is always a market for diverse content, right? There are still going to be queer people on either side of the house. What the difference is, on our side, queer people do not need to rely on only this small market of queer creators, right? They can now find themselves in every single text. This is so important because then they're not locked out of higher literature, right? When you study Shakespeare in class, when you study all those classic pivotal texts, right? You can find yourself in it, you can engage, you can write your essays, and I'm not giving a C- because you went against the author's purpose. Okay, what else did they tell you? They tell you about The Handmaid's Tale and the context. I think this actually, I think we tell you enough at Emily that when you have to understand the context, when so much focus in putting in discovering the author's true purpose, right? I think this just systematically locks a lot of people out of literature because I feel they're not smart enough to get the context. They feel there's so many steps. They can't just read the book and get a feel for it, right? They have to know all this stuff. I think this just means, regardless of you're like a minority or like a white male, right? I think a lot of people just like disengage with literature because they think it's too hard. But then secondly, note that their example is how The Handmaid's Tale applies to a modern day context and Trump America reproductive rights. I don't think Trump existed in Margaret Atwood's days. Therefore, people did in fact put a modern spin in it. They discovered their own message in the book. I think this just actually works for our case. Okay then, what do we tell you about like what the reader finds in this book? We tell you about how absolutism is a really dangerous thing, right? They tell you in the POI about misinterpretation. 3 responses here. Firstly, it's not unique to either side. Misleading quotes are always used. Secondly, it's not needed to like justify like either side just does bad stuff. Either side uses religion to like justify bad stuff. And like lastly, and this is most important like for the author stuff as well, the author is not God. You write a book, it doesn't mean you are literally Jesus and who knows everything and is always right? Every different perspective is completely valid, right? It should be okay to find something that was not meant to be there in the text. It should be okay to go, hey, Frankenstein like has some gay subtext in it, right? This is the world we stand for. Okay then. On the reader, we tell you about the literary canon. We tell you about old white men. Even if you take them at their very, very best case, right? Every benefit they get on their side, we just get it more, right? Because more people see themselves in the book, right? There are online communities writing Harry Potter gay fanfic. I can confirm that that was not J.K. Rowling's purpose, right? Like, I think also what this means then, when people engage with literature, all literature, not just the diverse authors, what does this mean? It means people are more interested in like higher education, or like at the very least, right? People just enjoy reading more, right? I think that's a huge benefit. Like they just like do mildly better in school, right? Literature is more successful because people read it for fun. In the middle end of the scale, right? More people go to higher education. People stop opting out of like literature, right? Because now they like can connect with text. At the highest end of the scale, you have more like minorities going to university to study humanities, learning the most important things, being able to eloquently and critically speak out against like the issues that face you and your communities, right? If this is what the death of the author theory means, if this is how you can reclaim a text that is like meant to be offensive, meant to be racist towards your community, and instead you reclaim it, you make it your own, you inspire future people to like do really good stuff. You just get more authors on our side. I am so proud to stand.
We thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the second speaker of the negating teams.
Maybe I'm just a commerce student that dropped English, but the misogynistic Shakespeare book they reference, I literally have no clue what it is. And the reasoning for that is that over time, when we recognise that books are harmful, we no longer use them as the source of moral judgment. And I think that means a large amount of things will have the debate. Because I think at the point in time that intuitively pretty much everyone can accept that the claims that are made are bad, it is important that we learn from why those beliefs came and interpret those, something we only do on our side. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to look on framing. Secondly, I'm going to look about like relatability, and then finally kind of on these narratives and kind of authors. Firstly, on framing, in terms of how do people approach meanings, because I think that like they misinterpret like the kind of meanings in terms of what they look like. Because I think they look like one of 2 things. Either firstly, they challenge your own opinions, or B, you evaluate why they came about. Because when a book, for even on their best case, and I think the important thing to know at the top of this though, is that bad books with bad meanings probably do get dropped over time when people like kind of no longer want to engage with them. But I think you evaluate how the meaning interacts with society. You don't look at a misogynistic book and go, wow, that book says misogynism is good, so now I think misogynism is good. You question why those beliefs came about, right? I think if you look, you're able to do things like look at Shakespeare's views on women and evaluate the context he was in as to why those opinions came about. And I think that importantly though, I think a lot of their examples are quite a stretch, right? Because the catharsis of Harry Potter fan fiction probably doesn't really come from the like meaning of it, because those things just come from characters. They come from like, you know, subplots or whatever. They come from the lore of the world. They don't come from like the meaning of Harry Potter of like love is the strongest thing in the world or whatever, right? Like, and importantly, that means a lot of their content kind of just naturally falls out. I think even if you think it's quite compelling, it's just not really relevant to this debate. Right, so that explains like how we should approach meanings. They claim that this allows people to like relate and feel good about things. I think firstly, it is unclear why this has to be done to be this one specific book, right? Because obviously there is a like, I think that in a world without Harry Potter fan fiction, you probably have things like online communities that maybe talk about like video games or whatever. You probably have like queer community forums or whatever. I'm unconvinced why this is the like only specific way in which they can get, which I think at the very least vastly mitigates the scale of their benefit. But secondly, I think you're just unlikely to relate to a book with a vastly different interpretation, right? Because stories are likely have characters made in line with the times. Because I don't think you're likely to like relate to a woman that's depicted in Shakespearean times at the point in time where she's likely portrayed in quite a misogynistic fashion. So I don't think they get relatability on their side of the house. But I actually think it makes it far worse, because there is an opportunity cost of buying into literature which is more reliable, right? Because when you read into the subtext about a book from 100 years ago that has a subtext about queerness, you're not looking at an authentic representation, right? When you otherwise could have engaged with a book which like A, is just more relevant to you, and B, it is just like has a better representation, because obviously the author set out with the express purpose to represent that community. And I think that secondly now, and I think this is where, now I'll move to harmful narratives. I think the first thing to say is that you do not approach these harmful narratives with positive viewpoints, right? Because obviously people's morals don't shift. Because I think that that it is likely true that when you read a book, you, as we tell you, you likely kind of challenge your own beliefs. But I don't think it's fair to say that's to the extent that you go from having been raised in a like liberal Western democracy to now being like, wow, I believe in the Shakespearean interpretation of women. But I think the second thing to say is you likely encounter for people that held these fringe views, you likely encounter them in elements of society, right? Like I don't know, there probably are still like people that unfortunately do agree with Oscar Wilde. But the important thing is that you are able to understand the underlying causes of these things that you can only do when you interpret the meaning of these authors, right? And that means you're able to kind of cope with these things more, target the root causes, be able to change those beliefs, all those things. But I think thirdly, and I think this is deadly for their case, schools are selective with what they choose, right? Because a sexist Shakespeare isn't the only play they can engage with. I think, you probably end up reading, A Midsummer Night's Dream or whatever. You go to the far more suitable texts that have good meanings. And so, sure, they can point to a number of examples with books with bad meanings, but it's unclear why people use those as the moral authority of society. The weighing for this though, are the most important books are the ones that are able to make you look at other perspectives. I think that looking at the perspective of women that have been oppressed in society, look at the perspective of what the times of those look like. Makes you less likely, as Kate tells you at first, to no response, to fall down the rabbit hole of going back into those times with the regression we've seen in rights. I think that this can only happen under our side of the house. Next time they make is that it's elitist and it locks people out of classrooms. But I think that the thing that this misses is that people's opinions on the meanings are able to differ. And I think that this isn't a debate around the opinions on the meanings. It's a debate on what meanings are seen as the valid interpretation. And that sounds like a nerdy clarification. But the importance of that is that it's saying, did Shakespeare mean this thing? Or what is the meaning of a misogynistic text this thing? Or is it my rose-coloured lens of it? And I think that you are able to therefore offer your opinions on that meaning. I think that means that a lot of their harms fall out. But now I want to whip and weigh a lot of the content we get, Kate, which I think has been quite egregiously under-responded to. So I think the weighing on author's intentions, and I think the vast majority of books that are read currently, sure, there are some classics books, but these are just some well-known ones. And the harm of that is that just the vast majority of books that are read, I think, are new. And they're highly likely to be a minority if they're voicing their opinion, because they need to bring a niche to the table to contribute something new. And I think that means that you are able to have a lot of new perspectives you otherwise would not have, right? Because people are able to have authors which can create meanings. Because I think that people probably know about the stuff in society with Shakespeare. But importantly, you might not consider the meaning that can be behind the effects on an Asian American living within British society, right? And I think that the thing that's at the end of the speech, I want to emphasize. Authors believing their voice will be heard is important, and the content Kate gives you is debate-winning, because it is logically prior to whether they make the book in the first place. If the book isn't made in the first place, their benefits fall out of the debate because there is no incentive for this to be made in the first place, therefore I negate.
We thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the third speaker of the affirming team.
My coach has stolen all of my aura. I'm not even going to be able to speak at all. It's going to be gibberish. If I were to believe exactly what the author felt about their own work every time I read it, after I read Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, I would thoroughly believe that Irish people could not succeed at school because all they were good at was blowing things up. Right? 3 things to do in my speech. Firstly, on framing. Secondly, on the state of books and wider English academia. And lastly, on the reader's experience, specifically with how they engage with books. All right, so firstly, some notes on framing. Like, we give you a lot of really, really well mapped out stuff right at the top of first about books, right? A lot of book spec knowledge happens here, right? The type of books and the nature of the author's purpose. I think Neg largely abandons their push that entertainment-focused books don't matter here. I think a lot of the examples that they bring up are also entertainment-focused books. Like, The Handmaid's Tale has got a good meaning behind it, but it is also just like a really, really good novel, right? I feel like that falls into that category as well. What we tell you about is the classic, like, literatical, I don't know, the literacy canon, right? These old white dudes who essentially decide what books are important and what books aren't important, right? Neg tries to weigh this down a lot through their speech, but I don't think it's convincing, right? We don't hear any response to the idea that when the author's purpose is uncertain, it is these people who decide what that purpose is. I think this is really, really big in this debate, right? We tell you, right, when we don't know whether Shakespeare for sure wanted Shylock to be the villain or not, you have this group of, like, in either world, before a change happens, disgruntled white people who make that decision. Those people probably don't like Jews very much, right? So they largely make a decision that is not beneficial towards our main stakeholders in this debate, right? So, going on, the state of books. I think we have a huge path to victory here that Neg just does not really engage with that much at all. I think if we can prove that the academic climate is much more equitable, right? For us, that means, like, specifically raising the marginalized into these positions. We get a lot of very tangible, very permanent, and very severe outcomes here that Neg does not anymore have enough time to get rid of. For Neg, they really need to prove here how authors are disincentivized from authoring by their lack of clarity and purpose, and furthermore from that, prove how that still affects society. So on this distortion of purpose, largely I think it's not given enough attention, right? I think in the case of you worrying about somebody co-opting your own work, the only real mech that we get here is that this fear causes you to not want to write the book at all. Firstly, I think even if you buy that this is a valid incentive that authors have, I don't think this is the difference maker between whether you write the book or whether you don't. I feel like you spent so much time developing your writing ability. Your dream is to become an author. You get to this position, right? I feel like that makes it really, really unlikely that you are going to step off of that diving board at that point and decide you're not writing the book anymore. Even more so though, I don't get why this is necessarily always a harm. I think marginalized people, like if you are writing a book about your struggle in Latin America and somebody else who is struggling, who is also marginalized, reads that book and has like a cathartic connection with it, I don't see why that is harmful to you as an author just because it's like the wrong type of marginalization, right? I think they probably, you still get a lot of that benefit. I certainly think then it doesn't mean that you're less likely to go into authoring or write the book at all, right? So then on the academic climate, mainly on the stuff that we tell you that books get you there, right? Not yet. So the degree to which you engage with books means that that determines how likely you are to get places on an educational point of view. This means that like the push that we hear from Neg, that like, oh, you can have these interactions, these social groups forming around things like video games with queer characters in them, don't really work, right? It's really, really hard to get a PhD in literacy from a uni when all you know about is like Doom and Call of Duty, right? Because they are inherently just not as valued by those canonical things. So there's a lot of weighing here. I think this is quite possibly the biggest path to victory. Why? A few reasons. I think even if you buy a lot of AFT's restricted author material, I think we weigh it out. I think we simply, like, for every one author on their side that you buy either doesn't write the book or writes a different type of book because they're scared that their message is misinterpreted, you have a whole lot of people on our side who are only in that position because of the way that they're able to interpret the classics to prove their legitimacy to the higher-ups in the way that they engage with Shakespeare in their own special way, right? I feel like this is more important for a few reasons. Firstly, tangibility. Like, there's a clear outcome with this high-level canonical stuff. Like, if you understand Shakespeare a lot, you are like pretty tangibly guaranteed to do a lot better in education, in your high school English class, in your university English class, right? Next stuff though is just not guaranteed here. For the marginalized, I think this kind of education is key. This is how you get people like Kate Shepherd. This is how you get people like Martin Luther King, right? This is really key for marginalized people, not only as individuals to get education to improve their own like living standards, right? But in order to inspire greater movements. I'll take that PY before I continue on.
You say that these texts are really hard to engage with, but if that's true, why would these more marginalized people get harmed from engaging with them if they're not able to engage in the first
I think,
place?
Sam, they're difficult to engage with in the case when they fundamentally disagree with who you are as a person, right? I feel like, yes, Shakespeare is hard to read, right? But if Shakespeare appeals to you on a moral level and makes you feel included in society, that gives you the drive that you need to put the work into translating the these and thous and those to use, right? That is not, I think that is on our side, we make you more motivated to do that sort of thing. So on the reader experience, the path to victory here, I think the biggest thing is emotional and developmental outcomes for the mainly marginalized reader, right? Both sides kind of don't really care about the average little white boy reading Harry Potter, right? So here needs to, I think, weigh down the stuff downstream of their previous clash. Note that the fact that that stuff even exists is quite shaky at this point. And secondly, prove that people don't base a lot of their moral judgments on these books, which is stuff that comes out mainly at second neg, right? So essentially, on ye old canon, right? We hear that these books don't matter, they're not read, or at least if you do read them, you don't base moral judgments upon them. I think there's a few reasons why this just is not true. Firstly, these are internalized by the status of the book. Right? Your school, your university, treat these books with high regard. We prove this to you with no contestation. I think what that means is not only are you thinking Shakespeare thinks I'm a terrible person, the school thinks my moral judgments are wrong, right? The society thinks my moral judgments are wrong. I think what this means is because people are so likely to internalize things they hear from school because they're young and kids, right? I think that means that you give them legitimacy in your head. You get into this negative self-talk way. Everyone thinks that the way that I am is wrong, including J.K. Rowling. Right? Comparatively, while Frankenstein isn't quite as gay as Heartstopper, right? I think it's a lot more legitimate along these same lenses. You are not probably going to be able to do a PhD on Heartstopper, but you can do one on Frankenstein. And if you can find the same meaning from both of those texts, those benefits are really, really clear, right? And the idea that you go to classics with better meanings, I think even if so, right, you just don't get any of these benefits on neg, right? Globally, these credited authors are very taught, Frankenstein, Shakespeare, etc. And there's kind of standards that you read. Your teacher is probably going to give you the most famous Shakespeare novel that's in the curriculum that they have to teach you. They would have to be very, very passionate to pivot and go, hey, I think this book is a bit bad. I'm going to go out and get 30 copies of this other book just because I like it and I think it teaches better moral judgments, right? So at the end of this, I think this is a big clash for sure. I think the most important person in this clash is for instance, your Jewish student getting a C because of the way that Shylock is interpreted. These people's lives change because the way that their lives are interpreted differently by the society around them and the school around them. It is tangible that you internalize self-hatred from these classics unless you are given the freedom to choose. And that's why I'm very proud to affirm.
We thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the third speaker of the negating routine.
AF lost this debate when they told you that feeling a little bit better when you read is more important than books being meaningful and contributing to progressive society. How are we going to win this debate? We win this debate when we prove to you that the meaning behind books as written by authors is extremely important, and the loss of this directly harms both readers and society, which is so much worse than someone not being able to relate to like Katniss Everdeen or something. Main points of question in this debate being like perspectives in books, and then secondly, who you should care about. First of all, on perspectives in books. They told you that when there's only one way to view a text, people are cut out of literature because they can't see themselves in it. A couple of responses to this. First of all, for every queer person who sees himself in a book, there will also be some sort of homophobic person who sees themselves in a book and their opinions validated. So this doesn't actually create any change because there's still people from like opposing ends of like the spectrum still seeing themselves in literature and being validated. Whereas on our side, authors write to like prompt change, right? So they're thinking more short term and we're thinking more long term. On their side, they get the short term benefit of feeling like a little bit more validated when they read a book. There's someone in there who like looks a little bit like them. Whereas on our side of the house, we get authors who are writing to prompt change for these things, which actually creates change in society and means that these people are able to relate to like many more books and feel more validated for their opinions, whether or not like a mainstream author like writes a book that is like able to cater to their opinions.
Yeah, why?
We also fail to see how they can't get validation in like other ways and places, and how they like need to get validation from these books specifically. They also claimed that it makes people's opinions like feel invalid. We tell you, what about the author's perspective becoming invalid? This is much more harmful because we tell you that the authors like directly impact the readers. So if you care about the readers, you also have to care about the authors. Secondly, in their world, opinions themselves become like invalid because literature becomes like a culture of like people pleasing. This means that authors are like writing to like make sure that they're not offending anyone, or trying to write so that they get every single person's perspective, or so that every single person can relate with what they're writing, which means that they don't have like a clear message that they're getting across, and they don't actually have an opinion about the world. If no one has an opinion about the world, no one's going to create any change because everyone's just trying to make each other happy, and realistically, this is not a good thing. They also told you that like the literary canon limits like what perspectives are heard because it's supposedly all just like old white men's opinions. First of all, we tell you that the literary canon does not look how like they claim it to be. We tell you that people study The Handmaid's Tale in class as well as Shakespeare, and also how books are studied in class is important. You can question the author's meaning, why it came about, why it's bad. On their side of the house, if they're not talking about directly why the author wrote that, then they can never engage with the society at that time and what like caused that perspective and opinion to like come about. On our side, secondly, on our side of the house, it progressively gets better over time because the books are like, the books like we're currently studying are like much better than they were like 5 years ago, right? So like the more the opinions of the authors are challenged, the like more progressive the literary canon gets, and the more like people's opinions are opened, and the more perspectives you see in books. Therefore, on our side of the house, we get more perspectives in books long term, and we think about how this actually changes society rather than just how people feel when they read a book in the short term. Secondly, on the point of clash of who you should care about. They tell you that we should prioritise the reader more than the author because simply there is more of them. First of all, just because there is more of them is not a good enough reason to prioritise them over authors. Secondly, authors are equally, if not more important, because they directly influence the reader, right? Readers are influenced by the knowledge they get, and the knowledge they get comes from authors. If the way that authors are writing is changing, that also it like directly impacts the way that like readers are interpreting them and like the amount of knowledge they're getting, and that shapes their opinions about the world. Thirdly, if authors aren't heard, they won't make books, so they don't get any benefits either, and their case just falls. Because if authors like lose the incentive to write their books, they're not going to write them. This kind of goes back to some characterization here that I'm going to go over. So what do authors look like and why do they write? Authors write to either share a perspective they think that someone can relate to, or because they think it's a perspective that like needs to be shared that is like not getting enough recognition, right? If they aren't heard, they have no incentive to write because either someone is like not relating to the story that they have, or they're like completely disregarding the perspective that they think needs to be shared. So their entire like life's work and the thing that they've put so much time and effort and thought into is like entirely made redundant. That like makes authors have absolutely no incentive to write, because obviously being an author and writing a book is like a massive thing. And people like go into this profession because it's something that they care really passionately about. So on their side of the house, if there's like changing the entire way that like literature works, you're not going to have authors writing, so they can't claim any of the benefits that they supposedly have. The benefits only come on our side of the house when authors actually are incentivized to write and actually create real change.
POI.
Yes.
So maybe can people not still agree with the author, but maybe should also people not disagree with the author when the message is like super transphobic, for
That's
example?
exactly what we're telling you. It's important to focus on what the author is actually trying to get across and what the author is actually trying to tell you, so that you can like analyze that rather than trying to analyze the 50 million other perspectives that other people are having about their book and how they have interpreted it. Which is why the author's meaning itself is so much more important, because it's what the book was like prompted to like tell you, and it reflects like what society is about at that time and what like needs to change in society, right? This is what we've been telling you the entire time. So let's do some weighing of our points. First of all, on like the effects of the author. We tell you that the author directly influences the reader. So when the author is harmed, so is the reader. So if you care about the readers, you should also intuitively care about authors. Secondly, on like the effect of the reader. Authors tell readers how to change the world, but authors are the ones who actually create the change. So if the way they get knowledge changes, this is bad because it has a flow-on effect and it changes the world. On F's side, this is for the worse, because they're creating a superficial society where people like don't have opinions, they're all people pleasers, and they're not actually creating long-term change for the people who need it the most. The people they care about who aren't represented in books aren't actually going to get the change that they need on their side of the house, whereas on our side of the house, we do. Their best case is that people feel a little bit more validated because somehow they still get authors writing, which we tell you actually isn't going to happen. But their worst case is literature dies and authors quit, which is like obviously a bad thing, because we tell you that authors are so important to society for all the reasons that we stepped throughout Kate and Sam. Our worst case is that we end up with maybe people feeling a little bit like less happy when they read a book for the first time because they can't relate to the character directly. But our best case is that long term these people actually do see themselves in literature, society itself changes. This is far, far better. At the end of this debate, what you should believe. You should believe that we have addressed the effects of the author, and that these are really important, because obviously it's really harmful for someone to like essentially ignore you as an author. It changes your career entirely and means that your life's work is for nothing. So this does not incentivize you to write books. Obviously books are important, so if you're not getting authors, you're not getting books. This is an obvious and clear harm. We told you that the effects on the reader are just as important, because readers themselves shape the world. If they are narrow-minded and like they're not actually looking at like important perspectives and how they change the world, this is bad. The main kind of like clearing up lastly here, the main kind of books and literature we're talking about in this debate is not like purely informative or entertainment, because they're factual and straightforward, but about the books that have an experience or perspective that has a deeper meaning. Also, this debate doesn't like just take place in the classroom, it takes place in the real world. So all their points about someone like not being able to like get like higher education because they can't engage with the book actually fall out of the debate, because it's not true, and we told you that that's assertive. It's not about this, it's about understanding, which is like something that you can learn in school, and you don't have to like relate with a person to understand the meaning behind it, which is why we win this debate.
We thank the speaker for their speech, and as is traditional for debating, we will reverse the team order for replies. So I welcome up the reply speaker of the negating team.
Two things to do in this reply. Firstly, on bad messages, and then secondly, on books that try and portray good messages. Firstly, on bad messages, and I think the framing, which I think is the realistic framing we give you, is we obviously don't have to support these bad messages. This is not about supporting these bad messages, it's about interpreting what is in the text, right? I think that thinking that Shakespeare includes a feminist lens ignores what his society believed in the past, right? And I think the massive harm that comes from this when you subvert to this is you further platform these beliefs, right? Because at the point in time where you do perceive them through a gold colour lens, people are more likely to engage with them in the first place. I think all that explains this really effectively. But I think additionally, you engage with the causation of these things, right? You know more about the societal harms, right? You learn from history. And frankly, on weighing, I don't really care to a debate-winning extent if someone feels slightly uncomfortable in an English class. If the opportunity cost means that someone ignores the signs of America slowly marching towards fascism. Because even if you read a book about that has lenses that, for example, are like anti-immigrant, you don't look at those and you go, oh wow, now I'm anti-immigrant, or I need to voice my support of this, or I will get a C- or whatever. You look at that and go, what led to their society pushing this as a meaning, and therefore you are likely to look at your world better. I think that broadly that is. Shea himself, though, says that classics that have these more harmful messages are hard to read. So if there's such a high barrier to entry, they're probably not read by the far most marginalized in this debate, which I think means that their harms are quite mitigated. You also, if all you care about is relatability, have the capacity to just engage in other spaces. I don't think that there is a unique capacity to get relatability out of books in a way that messages can. And the weighing here is that these classics, I just think, are not what is read most of the time, right? Sure, there are some famous ones, but I think the majority of what people read are the kind of newer books purely just because they're more relevant to people. And given that was their entire case, they did need to prove it was to a debate-winning extent. The fact they didn't is pretty crushing. But on good messages, I think that there are still, and this we told you all the way at K, I whipped it, and I just think the fact they didn't engage with it was pretty bad. There's still a lot of perspectives yet to be evaluated, right? And I think these are the most high-weight stories in this debate, because obviously, if you haven't shared perspectives yet, it is of the most marginalized. It's looking at things trans rights and stuff, and those kind of positive messages. And importantly, the authors weigh the risk of being misinterpreted really highly, right? Shea tells you it's a lot of people's dream. I think that's what the dream stems from, is being able to communicate your ideas, communicate your perspectives. And so I think that the risk of all of the books in the future from the lived experience of marginalized people not being created in the first place is a massive harm they have to stand for, right? Because co-option is incredibly harmful, not just to the author, but for society, because you only evaluate your own perspective, right? And I think that this received very little engagement. You only apply your perspective onto things, right? You only think that the world is about issues that you think about. I think that you're also able to realise why these are made, right? Margaret Atwood talks about women's rights because she was in a period of these bad things. And I think what that means is that you think of why she did this, the harms that have happened through history. I think that there is a difference between meanings and beliefs. They never reckoned with that. They lose the debate.
I thank the speaker for their speech and welcome up the reply of the affirming team to conclude this debate.
Margaret Atwood wrote The Handmaid's Tale about the horrors going on in Afghanistan. The meaning of the text for us today is that America is falling into dystopia, and we can recognize it. This is a change. This is a death of the author, because we are recognizing something that is not her intention, and we are applying it to a modern context, right? I think that texts do change, right? I think that if the intention of an author is to be racist, under neg, the meaning of the text is to demean people of color. In our world, maybe the book has other themes. Maybe J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter isn't about the fact that she compares Jewish people to goblins. The point of the text is that there's the magic of friendship, and that everyone has a place in the wizarding world, right? I think when you pull your own meaning out of these contexts, it just provides a much wider area for you to engage with these texts and for you to just feel a lot better about yourself. A couple things to do, just some general comparison across this reply. But firstly, some really quick on framing, right? So the death of the author is about the intention of the author and how we perceive it to create the meaning of the text, right? I think that I just told you in the intro about the meaning of the author, the intention of the author. We tell you that the majority of texts you study in schools, maybe not in your particular individual school, but on a global scale, most people study Shakespeare, most people study the same degree of certain authors because they are famous, because they're in the literary canon as we defined to you at first, right? Because we tell you of how restrictive the literary canon is, of that people pick them. This is really important, right? We told you that the people picking the literary canon aren't going to be the people buying into the queer subtext in Frankenstein, right? They're going to say that Frankenstein is a book purely about the atrocities of humanity and all that type of stuff, right? I think when you totally miss this subtext, it's really terrible, because now that's not the correct answer, right? This material we give you on absolutism is really big. I use the example of the Bible, right? This just shows this sheer span of impact here, because when there is one correct way to perceive a text, you do cut people out. Do not let them minimize this, right? You are that Jewish student. Because the author's purpose is unclear across history, but we have a room of people, uncontested, we have a room of people that are picking what is the purpose. These people control the narrative. These people control what we believe and what is the correct answer. I think this does mean that Shylock is the bad guy in Merchant of Venice. I think this does mean that Frankenstein wasn't gay, right? I think all of this stuff just plays into how we perceive the text around them, right? I think on readers, right, we tell you about finding themselves within the text, right? Subtext isn't picked up by people controlling the literary canon. We tell you there are things hidden throughout history, right? They tell you a lot about society pushing these values, right? But I just generally think that readers need a way to find themselves in text, right? I told you that it's very isolating when the only media you can find that you can put yourself into was exclusively created for that purpose. You're not normal. You are going to a separate media made just for you, right? I think that when you engage with all media, this is really massive, right? I also think on authors, right, they do a lot of really assertive work here, telling you just how authors just going to quit forever because people criticize them, right? I think this just makes no sense, right? Because authors get a barrage of 1-star reviews in the status quo every single day, right? I think if you're that susceptible to people's opinions that you become a robot with no opinion, then you literally just don't be an author, because you just can't present your opinions to the extent of writing a book without a barrage of editors telling you that's not true, right? I think that they tell us that they're really passionate about writing. I think this just means that you believe they are really passionate about presenting their ideas. I don't think this changes. I think at the end of this debate, what really matters is the catharsis, is the joy, is all this that comes out. I am proud to stand.
We thank the speaker for their speech and both teams for a good debate. I now invite you to cross the floor and shake hands.
What kind of